General Hospital spoilers for reveal that in a move that no one in Port Charles could have foreseen. And one that now threatens to upend the very foundation of the Corinthos and Quartermain dynasties. Caitlin McMullen, the actress who has long portrayed the wounded yet resilient Willow Tate, has broken her silence in a shocking new interview. Dropping what might be the most harrowing and electrifying clue yet about the trajectory of her character. What she revealed was more than a teaser, it was a crack in the dam. A prelude to an emotional detonation that may soon explode on screen. Her words were carefully measured, but the gravity beneath them was unmistakable. Anything is possible in the current state of Willow's mind. There are no guarantees anymore, not even about who she is. For fans who have watched Willow endure unspeakable trauma, surviving cults, leukemia, custody battles, betrayals, and the cruel loss of control over her own family, this was the moment that confirmed what some had already begun to suspect. Willow Tate is unraveling. But not in chaos. In silence. In calculation. And in the quiet between her broken breaths, a new Willow is being born, one who may soon commit the unthinkable. The whispers in the hallways of General Hospital have grown louder in recent weeks, especially after Willow lost custody of Amelia and Wiley, a devastating outcome she believed impossible. Thanks to Drew Quartermain's manipulation and false reassurances. The man she trusted, the man she gave up everything to be with, had promised her safety, had insisted she had nothing to worry about. But his hubris cost her everything. And now, her maternal instincts, once the source of her warmth, have turned inward, tightening like a wire around her sanity. Willow hasn't merely suffered. She's reached the edge of a cliff from which there may be no return. The truth is, the Willow we once knew, the healer, the forgiver, the optimist, is dead. And something else. Something colder and more ruthless, has risen in her place. What began as internal anguish is rapidly morphing into external action. McMullen's carefully phrased warnings hint at this transformation. The possibility that Willow's next move may no longer be emotional, it may be physical. Violent. Fatal. Rumors now swirl around Drew's future, suggesting that the man whose lies sent Willow plummeting into darkness may soon face the ultimate consequence, death. But not by the hand of an enemy, not by a criminal. Not even by someone seeking revenge for unrelated past sins, by Willow herself. Because she has lost too much, too quickly, and in her eyes, Drew is not a victim of circumstance. He is the architect of her destruction. He seduced her into believing in safety, then stood by as the court ripped her children away. And worse yet. It is only now that Willow may uncover the most unforgivable truth of all, that Drew, in a twisted act of selfishness, has also betrayed her with the one person who haunts her nightmares, Nina Reeves. Her biological mother. If this truth surfaces, if Willow realizes that not only has she lost her children but was played like a pawn in a sordid game between the two people she trusted least, then everything inside her could snap. No longer content to be a victim, no longer willing to wait for others to save her, Willow may take matters into her own hands. The theory gaining traction in fan circles, bolstered by behind-the-scenes speculation, is that the writers are preparing for a seismic twist. Willow, pushed beyond all moral boundaries, will kill Drew. And it won't be accidental. It won't be dramatic in the soap opera sense of passion-fueled violence. It will be quiet. Premeditated. Executed by a woman who feels she has nothing left to lose. A woman who has realized that justice will never be handed to her, and so she must take it. The once gentle Willow, now stripped of family, dignity, and the illusion of security, may finally cross the line that she swore she never would. And in doing so, she would mark her place in General Hospital history forever. But the question lingers, how far will she go? Will she flee Port Charles with Wiley and Amelia, disappearing into the wind like so many before her? Will she frame someone else for Drew's death, perhaps even Nina, allowing her mother to rot in prison as poetic justice? Or will she simply confess, surrendering to the authorities in a final act of broken clarity, knowing full well that prison might be the only place she can grieve safely? Caitlin McMullen's remarks, deliberately vague yet charged with tension. suggest that Willow's arc is entering its darkest chapter. There's something unpredictable about grief when it's layered with betrayal, she said. When a mother feels like the world is conspiring to erase her, something inside her changes. Possibly forever. As the plot thickens, all eyes turn to the walls of General Hospital, not to the emergency room or the oncology wing, but to the shadows where vengeance festers and grief gives birth to monsters. If Willow is about to become a killer, she will do it not as a cold-blooded villain, but as a mother whose soul has been trampled, whose hope has turned to ash, and who no longer believes in second chances. And in that chilling possibility lies the most tragic twist of all, that in trying to reclaim her children, she may lose herself completely. Stay tuned. Because when the truth comes out, when Drew's secrets surface, and when Willow finally makes her move, General Hospital may never be the same again. Under the crushing weight of heartbreak, betrayal, and powerlessness, Willow stood on the edge of a psychological transformation no one around her seemed prepared for. Once the symbol of compassion and calm within the chaos of Port Charles, she now found herself pushed into a storm of deception that unraveled everything she had come to believe in. The lies were not merely fragments of personal disappointment, they were catastrophic revelations that shattered the trust she had placed in those closest to her. At the center of her unraveling was Drew, the man she had clung to after the demise of her marriage to Michael. A man who promised strength and loyalty but delivered manipulation and false hope instead. He assured her she would never lose custody of her children, even as his behind-the-scenes actions were contributing to the very outcome he swore would never come to pass. In the courtroom, when the gavel struck against her favor and Michael walked away with full custody of Wiley and Amelia, a scream rose in her chest but died in her throat. She collapsed not just from shock but from the visceral betrayal she could feel rotting the foundation beneath her. And it didn't stop with Drew. In her darkest hours, Nina, her biological mother, was revealed to be complicit in a scheme so cruel it left Willow questioning the very meaning of maternal love. Nina had known Drew's intentions were not pure. Worse, she had not only enabled them but had also resumed her own twisted romantic involvement with him in secret. When the pieces fell into place, and Willow realized that the man who held her as she cried at night was also the one who shared a bed with her mother, a deep, soul-crushing nausea seized her. The betrayal was so personal, so grotesquely intimate, that it fractured something deep within her psyche. But perhaps what stung more was the realization that Michael, her former husband, the father of her children, had been watching from the sidelines, aware of some of these truths, and remained silent. His silence wasn't neutral, it was complicit. His desire to win custody, to erase her from the picture as a mother, had transformed him into someone she could no longer recognize. And then there was Sasha. Sweet, broken Sasha, who Willow once believed was her closest confidant, a sister in trauma, healing beside her after the death of Liam. Sasha had stood beside Michael, whispered comfort into his ear, and aligned herself with his choices, despite knowing what those choices cost Willow. The four of them, Drew, Nina, Michael, and Sasha, had orchestrated a quiet coup of her life. And Willow, the woman they once called selfless and kind, had finally snapped. Her thoughts began to drift toward darker territory. The dreams she had of reunification with her children turned jagged and bitter. No longer was she just envisioning a peaceful resolution, she began seeing herself storming the Quartermain mansion, grabbing Amelia into her arms, and fleeing into the night. But even those thoughts began to feel too passive. The Willow that emerged from the ashes of betrayal was no longer content with running. She wanted justice, raw, irreversible justice. The days grew colder, and so did her soul. She returned to her apartment and found herself staring for hours at framed photos of her children. The spaces on the walls where Drew's pictures once hung now empty and hollow. Each face, each memory, burned into her with the intensity of loss and fury. She began collecting evidence. Emails Nina had sent. Text messages Sasha had hidden. Whispered warnings from Tracy and Carly that she'd once dismissed. The puzzle pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. One by one, She realized how each of them played a role in dismantling her life. Her breathing would grow shallow as the rage surged inside her. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering to no one, "They don't deserve to keep breathing while I'm drowning." But it was the night she stood outside Michael's home and saw Amelia through the glass, happy, unaware, safe, that something inside her finally snapped. It wasn't going to be enough to reclaim her children. She needed them to suffer the way she had. And she knew exactly how. The whispers in her mind grew louder. She envisioned walking into the Quartermain mansion, not as a visitor, but as a force of reckoning. She knew the floor plan. She knew the routines. She knew who left which doors unlocked. When the household staff left for the evening, the thought wasn't abstract anymore. It was a plan. Drew would be the first. He had to be. She would watch the light leave his eyes as he realized he had underestimated her, that his smug condescension and false assurances would cost him everything. Nina would come next. Not through violence, but through exposure. Willow had collected enough evidence to destroy her publicly, to ensure she never held power again, to leave her bankrupt and alone. The way Willow had been made to feel. Sasha would suffer through isolation. Willow would ensure that everyone who once admired her for her bravery would see her now as the betrayer she truly was. And Michael, he would be last. He would live with what he had done. Watching Willow rise from the destruction he had helped cause. The nightmare for them would only begin when they realized she wasn't going to disappear quietly. But just when she thought she was alone in her madness, Kai appeared. Quiet, observant Kai, who had always seemed out of place in the Corinthos web, looked into Willow's eyes and didn't flinch. He recognized the chaos there because he carried his own. Perhaps he had his own scores to settle with Drew. Perhaps he had seen what Drew did to others behind closed doors. In Kai, Willow found not just understanding but complicity. He wouldn't stop her. He might even help. Their alliance formed in silence. In shared understanding that justice no longer lived within the courtrooms of Port Charles. If the system failed to protect the innocent, they would rewrite the system. Kai, in his calm, collected manner, provided the strategic mind Willow needed. He knew how to cover tracks, how to disarm surveillance, how to push psychological buttons. And most importantly, he believed her. He didn't call her crazy. He didn't try to save her. He simply stood beside her and asked, "What's the first move?" It would begin with Drew. And this time, it would not end until everything they had taken from her was reclaimed, or reduced to ash. Willow had once believed in the system, in love, in the redeeming power of family, truth, and second chances. But all of that had shattered the moment she was told she no longer had legal custody of Wiley and Amelia. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a verdict on her very soul. As if the years she had spent nursing Amelia through sickness, calming Wiley through trauma, and healing from cancer with nothing but hope and grit had meant absolutely nothing. Now those children, her children, were in the hands of people who didn't deserve them. Michael, who had lied and manipulated the court, Drew, who had promised protection and instead stood silent as she was stripped of her rights, Sasha, who once claimed to understand loss and betrayal, now wrapped herself in silence, and Nina, the mother she never asked for, who claimed to want unity but now whispered behind closed doors with people who once tore Willow apart. Something inside her had snapped, not in a reckless, chaotic way, but with terrifying precision, like a hairline fractured deep beneath the surface that finally gave way to an earthquake. And that earthquake had a name, desperation. But desperation, for Willow, had taken on a new form, not tears or pleas or late-night breakdowns, but planning, mapping, disguising, and most of all, reclaiming. She had memorized every detail of the Quartermain estate where her children now resided. The times the security team switched shifts. The frequency with which Michael stayed out late. The room where Amelia's nightlight flickered faintly at exactly 8:03 p.m. She had befriended the new nurse who occasionally helped the children after school. She never asked for favors, just information, disguised as casual curiosity. Every piece of knowledge became a weapon in her arsenal. Every scrap of gossip about Drew's travel plans, Michael's meetings, Nina's manipulations, it all fit together like a puzzle only she was determined enough to complete. Her old life, the gentle, careful teacher, the survivor of heartbreak and loss, was gone. Now, what remained was a woman who could no longer live without the heartbeat of her children beside her. She didn't blame the children, of course. She would never. But she couldn't forgive the adults who had stolen her motherhood in the name of stability. They called her unfit. They called her unstable. But no one in that courtroom knew the depths of her love, the ferocity of it. No one had stood with her during the night Amelia couldn't breathe. No one had seen the way Wiley had curled into her arms after a nightmare and whispered, "Please don't leave me." And yet, somehow, she had become the villain in a story she once believed she was writing with grace. Now, the only grace she had left was the kind that came with escape, silent, swift, and absolute. She had found a rental cabin 2 hours outside Port Charles. Remote, but not so far it would attract attention. It was perfect. She had stocked it with toys, formula, clothes. Even a laminated chart with feeding and nap schedules. She had prepared fake IDs, one for her, one for each child. She'd learned how to avoid surveillance cameras. She'd studied emergency response times in the area. She had considered every possibility, from the moment she stepped through the nursery door to the second she crossed state lines. Willow didn't think of herself as a criminal. She thought of herself as a mother pushed beyond her limit, a mother whose only remaining act of love was one the world would call madness. But there was a part of her, small, fragile, and buried beneath the rage, that knew once she took this step, there was no going back. There would be no redemption arc. No last-minute rescues. No soft, forgiving reconciliation. There would only be headlines, arrest warrants, custody investigations, and possibly jail. But none of that frightened her as much as waking up another day and knowing her daughter cried for her mother and no one answered. That Wiley asked, "Where's Mommy?" and was told to forget. She would not be forgotten. She would not disappear. If the world wanted to paint her as a ghost, she would haunt them on her own terms. She packed only what was necessary. She didn't cry as she folded Amelia's favorite blanket or slipped Wiley's stuffed bear into a bag. Her hands were steady, her eyes cold. She would wait for the right night, when the sky was dark. The house was quiet, and her rage could blend into the silence. She would not hurt anyone. But she would not hesitate to do what had to be done. And if anyone got in her way, if Drew or Michael or even Jason dared to try to stop her, she was prepared. Not with violence, but with the steely resolve of a woman who had been robbed of everything that once made her human. And yet, even as she prepared for the unimaginable, there was a part of her, some fractured, flickering light, that still hoped it wouldn't come to this. That Michael would remember what they had once been. That he would see past his own pain and realize the damage he was doing. That Drew would step aside and finally let her live her truth. But hope was a dangerous thing, and in the quiet corners of her mind, Willow had already let it die. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about survival. This was about a mother's final act of devotion. It would be her against the world, and for the first time in her life. Willow was not afraid to burn the entire world down if it meant she could hold her children again. She wasn't doing this because she wanted to. She was doing this because they had left her no other choice. There was a time when Willow believed in redemption, in forgiveness, in second chances. But that time had long since passed. What remained now was a broken silhouette of the woman she once was, shattered not by chance or fate, but by the deliberate choices of those closest to her. Drew had promised her safety, stability. A life where her children would never be ripped from her arms. And yet, in the coldest twist of irony, it was his hands, those same hands that once held her close. That once stroked her hair as she wept, those were the hands that orchestrated her loss, that led her blindly into a courtroom where she would be dismantled, humiliated, and ultimately undone. The pain she felt that day wasn't temporary. It wasn't something that would fade with time or be dulled by distraction. It was permanent. It lived under her skin like an infection. A low simmering rage that no longer asked for justice, it demanded it. The moment she left the courtroom, the truth was undeniable. She was alone. Not just legally. Not just emotionally. But spiritually. The man she had chosen, the man she had trusted above all others, had proven himself to be a coward, a traitor cloaked in sympathy. While she was falling apart, Drew was busy negotiating backdoor deals with judges, lying to her about outcomes, seducing her into a false sense of control. And all the while, behind closed doors, he was still connected to Nina, the woman Willow had struggled her whole life to accept as her biological mother. To discover that Nina and Drew had not only aligned politically but physically, emotionally, that their betrayal was deeper, older, more sinister than she imagined, was what finally broke her. The truth came to her in pieces. A photograph here. A half-burned note there. The scent of Nina's perfume on Drew's coat, the awkward pauses when she entered a room, the subtle deflections when she asked about his whereabouts. It was all there. Like breadcrumbs in a forest of deceit. But Willow wasn't lost anymore. She wasn't looking for a way back. She was looking for the edge of the cliff, and who she needed to push off of it. Drew became the target not just because he was the source of her pain, but because he represented everything she had been taught to tolerate. Lies disguised as protection. Manipulation passed off as love. Control masquerading as care. For years, Willow had silenced herself in relationships, made herself small, digestible, palatable to those around her. She had swallowed her needs, her instincts, her doubts, all in the name of peace. But peace had never been real. It had only ever been temporary silence before the next betrayal. Now, she was wide awake. And her awakening was dangerous. She began with distance. Emotional, then physical. She would stare at Drew across the kitchen table and imagine how easy it would be to make him disappear. He spoke to her about their upcoming wedding, how everything was back on track. How the press had been pacified, how Nina would keep her distance. It was almost comedic, watching him spin fairy tales while she envisioned him lying cold on a marble floor. Stripped of his smugness and self-righteousness. And yet, she said nothing. She smiled. She played her part. Because what Willow had realized was that true revenge wasn't about confrontation, it was about silence. Stillness. Waiting until the moment your enemy let their guard down entirely. She found herself tracing patterns on the kitchen knife handles. She memorized his medication dosages. She discovered Drew's hidden accounts, his shadow donors, his encrypted communications. She watched him meet with judges and lobbyists, took photos from afar, collected them like talismans for the storm she was preparing. She wasn't sure how she'd do it, not yet. But she knew that it wouldn't be impulsive. It wouldn't be messy. It would be elegant. Meanwhile, Michael had begun to sense something. He had grown distant too. No longer checking in with her about the children, no longer returning her texts promptly. He and Sasha had been seen together more frequently. And though Willow once believed they were just co-parenting, a part of her began to suspect more. She could feel the universe closing in, twisting her sense of reality, mocking her trust. Michael and Sasha. Nina and Drew. 4 corners of a prison that now enclosed her. Even Carly, who once seemed like an ally, had chosen silence. The betrayal was collective. A town-wide amnesia about everything she had sacrificed. But it wasn't just Drew's death she imagined anymore. It was escape. Freedom. Taking Wiley and Amelia and disappearing before the final strike. Drew thought he had outmaneuvered her in court, but Willow was done playing by the rules. She would disappear into the storm with her children and watch the town burn from the hills above. Still, there was one moment that haunted her, the possibility that she wouldn't be able to leave unless Drew was gone. Really gone. Not relocated. Not ruined. But buried. She sometimes stood above him in the night, listening to the soft rattle of his breath, calculating how long it would take to press a pillow against his face and hold it down. She envisioned every step, the panic, the struggle, the stillness. And the lie she'd tell after. Maybe he had a heart attack. Maybe he overdosed. He did take sleeping pills, after all. But as much as she imagined the physical act, she knew it would come down to timing. What she needed was one perfect moment when no one would question her. When the world would think she had already suffered enough. She had to play the role of grieving widow before she even became one. And then came the phone call, the one that changed everything. A stranger's voice. A warning. We know what he's done. We can help you. She didn't ask who. She didn't care. All she said was, I'm listening. That was the beginning of the end. Within days, Drew found himself under federal investigation for campaign fraud. Anonymous leaks were being funneled to the press. His donors withdrew. His image crumbled. And through it all, Willow stood by him, publicly, offering tearful speeches, gentle denials. The perfect grieving fiancée watching her man fall. But it still wasn't enough. He had to die. And when that day finally came, when Willow stared into Drew's eyes for the final time and saw the confusion, the realization that it had always been her, that she had orchestrated every thread of his unraveling, it wasn't rage she felt. It was peace. Because justice had never been about the courtroom. It had never been about the truth. It was about reclaiming control from the man who stole everything from her. And now, with Drew gone, Willow was free. But the town wasn't. Because the woman who had once been its heart, its healer, had become something else entirely. And Port Charles would never be the same again.